Good afternoon, and welcome back. We'll reconvene the subcommittee. And again, I appreciate everybody's indulgence. That should be the last vote series of the day, so we can go forward, Mr. Berry, and then with our second panel. At this time, I would like to recognize the distinguished gentlewoman from Washington, D.C., Ms. Norton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This hearing provides the opportunity, if we will use it, to clarify a number of matters. I want to thank you, Mr. Berry, because just in your first sentence, you have told the American people something that almost none of them know, and that is the very high-quality upper technology knowledge level of the workforce. I will guarantee you that there was almost no information when we hear what Federal employees, that generic term means that you're talking about judges, engineers, scientists, nuclear plant inspectors, as less than a third of private sector workers fall into this category. The apples to bananas comparisons have grown tiresome. What was particularly interesting to me was the extraordinary reduction in the Federal workforce since the end of World War II, where you say one Federal worker for every 78 residents in 53, in 2009, one for every 147. How much of this represents productivity of Federal workers? How do you account for that kind of reduction per capita?
Congresswoman, I think certainly productivity is a big piece of that in our technology. And one of the reasons the workforce has gotten more sophisticated is they had to do more with less. And so they needed to have people who could handle the technology. Just managing Federal contracts, for example, to ensure that there is not fraud for the taxpayers. You need highly skilled people. These are billions and billions of dollars they are accounting for and keeping track of. But take Medicare, for example. 20% of the Federal budget is Medicare, and it's administered by, I think the number is sort of like 0.002 of the Federal workforce. So it's the efficiency rate, in terms of the productivity and being able to deliver those payments accurately. It is a combination, I would argue, of highly skilled workforce and technology and productivity improvement.
Now, one of the things that both Democratic and Republican presidents have done over the past decades is to do more and more contracting out, as if that were the answer to all of our woes. Note that the Obama administration seems to be going in the opposite direction, expecting to save $40 billion annually by reducing the number of contracted out workers. Do these contracted out workers save us or cost us? Why have we been doing it?
It's a little on both sides of the ledger. There's no, I don't want it to fall into the same trap of sort of a gross average answer. Some cost us more over time. Some cost us and have true savings. So
do you know how? I mean, do you know what, I tell you one thing, if there's overtime, you keep track of it in the Federal workforce. You keep track of the productivity of your Federal workforce. What do you do about the contracting workforce?
Well, we don't track that. The Office of Management and Budget, Ms. Norton, would be the appropriate folks to get you that data, and the various agencies would track that data. But I unfortunately don't have that.
Well, it's very difficult for us to understand a Federal workforce that has more contracted workers than Federal employees when the focus is on Federal employees, and most of the workers, including workers that work alongside Federal employees, are contracting employees. Now, why would a contracting employee be working alongside a Federal employee?
I can give you a good example in my agency, and it goes to what the Office of Management and Budget has asked all of us to do, is to look at what are essential government functions that the government should be doing and what could be done by the private sector. OPM does 90% of the background investigations for security clearances throughout the government. We do all of the Department of Defense background investigations. We do that with about 2,000 government workers, but about—
Could I ask you one question before my time runs out?
Sorry.
The collective bargaining in the Federal sector, our workers do not bargain for pay or benefits. Is that so?
No, they cannot.
So what do they cost us? Is there any reason why anybody would want to pull back on collective bargaining in the Federal sector?
The Administration are strong supporters of the partnership approach. We believe that sort of workers and managers working together can produce better service to the taxpayers, and we are working in that direction.
Thank you very much, Mr. Berry.
Thank you. Now we'll recognize the distinguished Chairman of the Oversight Committee, the gentleman from California, Mr. Issa.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for holding this important hearing. Mr. Berry, good to see you again.
Sir.
Let me run through a couple of items. Just as somebody who came out of the electronics industry and allied with the auto industry, you know, we do have about a tenth as many people making about 8 times more cars, plus or minus some ratio. So doing twice as much over a period of 70 years or 60-plus years, I'm not sure should be the standard for the Federal workforce. However, I certainly think that the Federal workforce, and I would give you this, if they fail to give us efficiencies, it's as much this side of the dais at fault as it is your side or anyone else in the Administration. We are at a time, though, when we're trying to produce real savings. Mr. Chaffetz, before the break, talked to you about step increases. If you cannot support step increases today from a standpoint of their long-term effects, can you work with us to look for a way to have step increases frozen, even if there's a catch-up provision later, but for the specific year's budgeting, a freeze so that the President's freeze will in fact be a freeze not just for those who don't have step increases, but for everybody. And we're talking only step increases here, not any of the other merit-related that I know Mr. Chaffetz also was asking about. Is that something you can support if we work together on it?
Mr. Chairman, I think at this point in time, the answer would be no. I'm happy to go back and take that back and discuss that with the Office of Management and Budget to see if there'd be any opening there. But I believe what you're talking about is within grade increases. Am I correct?
Within grade. That's what we call step. And that's really where $500 million between now and the end of the year will occur, or between 3 weeks ago and the end of the year, would occur in automatic. You're simply still vertical. You could actually be disabled, but as long as you're still on the payroll, you're going to get these increases totaling about $500 million in this year alone, and then, of course, it continues up.
My concern with that, Mr. Chairman, would be we're talking about the retention rate. And
okay, so I'm going to cut you short for a moment. Right. Your view is we freeze for real, we have a retention problem.
If you can imagine, the within grades allow a natural progression. And, you know, especially for—
But my time is short. The President announced a freeze.
Yes, sir.
There is no freeze because with step increases, people are getting pay increases automatically. They are getting pay increases automatically this year. They will make more money. People on this side of the dais will make the same money this year they made last year and the year before because we have a freeze going on. We did not vote ourselves a pay raise. The President's announced a pay raise. The truth is, the pay freeze. The truth is there will be pay raises through this process, and you support that from a standpoint of retention. And a simple answer like that is fine. I'm not asking you to be on our side of that particular issue or even the President's side. Let me go to a couple more that I think are important. You mentioned Medicare. I would mention, as proud as I am that you do Medicare with so few people, that Medicare has a 10% fraud rate. It is the worst in health care. That is by our own IG, and it's by the stimulus oversight chairman and so on, that this is in fact the most fraud-ridden program. And we're talking not about necessarily bad doctors. In some cases, we're talking about organizations that pretend to be doctors and the system doesn't catch them. So the last point I want to ask a specific question on is, we just finished, just in your seat a couple of days ago, the GAO report being presented to us shows $100 billion in savings by consolidation, elimination of duplicative programs. Many of those are within the purview of the administration. They weren't created by unique act of Congress. Have you looked at whether or not the Federal workforce can be more efficient, take advantage of some of that $100 billion simply by some consolidation within the recommendations of that report? And if you haven't read the report, would you commit to read it?
Oh, absolutely. I'm aware of the report, Mr. Chairman, and I think, in fact, I have just a summary, sort of a one-page summary of the highest risk items that they mention. And what I would note is that 3/4 of those items have a human capital connection. And whether or not we are successful in addressing these issues are going to be incumbent on us, whether we have good people in the jobs to handle these issues. And so recruiting and retaining an outstanding workforce.
Okay, I see you've circled back to the same answer, and I appreciate that. Earlier you commented that the AEI and Heritage reports did not include an adjustment or a recognition of education, experience, and so on. In fact, I reviewed them, and they do. So would you look at them again and commit for the record to give us an answer on why you think there are flaws in their process? Because this committee is at a point of going back to the GAO and doing one more study to try to find out whether or not these organizations are correct in their assessments. Because if they are correct in their assessments, clearly we are probably paying some people too little, and we are clearly paying, according to them, some people quite a bit more than would be necessary to recruit and retain. So if you would give us your comments within, let's say, 2 weeks, that would allow us to make a decision going forward on action from here.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. I would be happy to do that.
Thank you. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We now recognize the distinguished gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Berry, it's good to see you again.
Yes, sir.
And thank you for being here. Let me first of all commend you for some movement that I have seen in promotions, especially as it relates to women and other members of minority groups, and I appreciate that movement that I've observed. Let me ask you exactly what was the President doing when he initiated a freeze? What was he accomplishing?
I think it's an important point, Congressman, that you've hit on, because it goes to some of the back and forth that we've had at the hearing here today, is the Employment Cost Index reflects the cost of labor increase that is determined by what is happening in the private sector. The Department, what we do is we get that data, and the law provides that Federal employees would get that minus 0.5%. That is not built into the budget every year. It has to be added or projected in terms of budgets, and it is an overarching number because it affects every employee of the Federal Government. All 2.1 million get that adjustment. The within grades that we were talking about here, not every employee gets that on an annual basis. Those are experience-based. So you need to, some people get them every year, some people get them every 3 years. So there are some people who don't get any for a 2-year period. And those numbers are not additive to the budget. They're built into the agency's baseline. There are always people leaving and coming. And as senior people leave, higher salary waged folks leave, younger folks come in at lower pay. And so that balances out within the agency budget. And so the reason why I would have argument with the numbers that were being thrown around is that those are within the overall budget. And what the President has done is to direct those downward. The President has a 5-year domestic spending freeze, which will take our budget to what it was when Eisenhower was in the White House. Now, that is a $400 billion savings. That's the way to approach reducing the Federal Government, not by across-the-board cuts, not by freezing within grades, but by dealing with the budget numbers that are real. That's what the taxpayers want. That's what the President is trying to deliver.
And at the end of the day, you've experienced some cost savings, and you've reduced the budget, and you've accomplished something. Let me go to another area. Many people that I encounter take the position, or they believe that somehow or another the public workforce is not as efficient, not as productive, and ultimately not worth as much as private sector employees. And almost no matter what kind of information you give to them, they still maintain that feeling. Have you ever encountered any studies, any reports, any information that would validate that kind of thinking?
There aren't any, sir. In fact, I can give you sort of two things I think address your point. First is my own experience. I've been in Washington, D.C. since 1985 and sat in the chairs where many of your staff are sitting today, and would regularly hear members of the Reagan administration and the Bush administration come in and their answer under testimony was, what do you think of Federal employees? And to a person, every one of them said, I have been so impressed with the quality, the integrity, the work ethic, the dedication, and the skill that I've encountered. And in fact, many of them were listed as the biggest surprise they encountered in Washington. Now, I was with Clay Johnson last Friday night. He says the exact same thing. So I think anecdotally, people who are around Federal employees who see what they do come away very impressed. But the other thing, if I could just very quickly, is we survey our employees every year with questions. The most recent employee survey showed that 97% of respondents answered positively to the question, when needed, I am willing to put in extra effort to get the job done, whether it means staying late, whether it means working over a weekend, whatever. I will work to get it done. It matters to America. Our Federal employees are committed. They understand the criticality of their mission. They are defending us from terrorists. They are protecting our interests. And I am here to tell you I have never seen a study that would question their work ethic.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I believe that completes. Mr. Conyers? Cummings? I'm sorry. The distinguished ranking member of the Oversight Committee. Mr. Cummings, thank you.
One of my concerns is that Mr. Berry, is that Director Berry, is that so often Federal employees are getting a bad rap. We all up here work with Federal employees every day, and we see what they go through. On this side of the aisle, every single one of our employees had to take a 5% cut. Their salaries wasn't frozen, took a cut. In a time when milk is going up, gas is going up, rent is going up, they took a cut. And a lot of times I think we forget that public employees carry out very important functions until they're not present. And we take so much for granted. And part of the reason why we take so much for granted, Director Berry, is because they are dependable. And you said something a little bit earlier, and I want you to elaborate on this. I look at the people who work for me, work with me rather, and I look at their education levels, and I know without a doubt that they could be making a whole lot more money than working on this Hill. I know that they could be working a lot less hours. Some of them working to 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning. And they don't get a whole lot of money. And so, and I know that they get certain benefits, but you've gone over those benefits. And I just want you to go back, because I'm tired of these public employees being beaten up on. It pains me tremendously. And so I just want you to go back, and you said something about education. And because I see, and by the way, when you talk about education, a lot of them are struggling trying to pay back loans because they wanted to be the best that they could be. They wanted to take advantage of opportunity. They wanted to come, and then after they got an education, they didn't go to Wall Street. They didn't go looking for the big bonuses. They came because they wanted to serve the public. And they have shedded blood, sweat, and tears, simply trying to lift us up, to make this Congress better, to make sure our airports are safe, even cleaning the airport bathrooms, cleaning these places, cafeterias. So talk about that education thing again, because I think we lose sight of that. Everywhere else, by the way, you get elevated because you get an education. A lot of these folks have an education and they just stay pretty much level funded. And now I know over the next 2 years, the President has said they're going to have they're going to be level funded. But anyway, talk to me about that.
Well, Mr. Cummings, the President, as are all Americans, grateful for the sacrifice that Federal employees are enduring. The pay phrase for the 2 years is a real sacrifice. As you mentioned, especially those who have families who have to deal with the inflationary costs and pressures on a family, the cost of milk, the cost of gas, they still have to commute, and they still have to deal with those costs. And the President is clearly aware of their sacrifice and is grateful for it, and recognize that they were the first ones asked to step up to the plate to help the country address the deficit.
And by the way, let me just interject something. When I had to ask the employees, when I took over this committee, the Democratic side, I had to ask every single employee, I asked them, would you take at least a 5% cut? And listen to me, Director, not one of them, not one, objected. And I asked them why. You know, I said, I know you're going to have tough times. They said, because we want to serve the public. And I think we have to be very careful in these conversations that we have, because we need to encourage the best and the brightest to come to government. We don't want to be caught up in a culture of mediocrity. We want the best. But anyway, I cut you off. What were you saying?
Well, Mr. Cummings, and I think it goes to what you were saying also about our benefit comparisons. And you're going to hear a lot that somehow our benefits are out of whack with the private sector. I would argue they're very much in line, especially when you account for that we don't have profit sharing or we don't have stock options in the Federal Government. And so most of my workforce is comparable with the large companies in the private sector. So it is not fair to compare Federal employees to the entire civilian labor force. I don't have retail clerks. I don't have short order cooks. I don't have waitresses. God bless all of those, and they should be paid as they should be paid. But to say the Federal employees should be paid based on that is not appropriate. You need to compare like to like, apples to apples. The Fortune 500 companies are much better comparison when you're looking at who we are competing for in terms of recruitment and retention. But going to your original question, sir, you asked, the current data from the current population survey shows that half of Federal workers work in the 9 highest paying occupations, such as judges, engineers, scientists, nuclear plant inspectors. By comparison, only a third of the private sector, the civilian labor force, work in those 9 categories. And then look at the opposite end of that spectrum. In contrast to a fifth of private sector workers in the 4 lowest paying occupations, the ones that have high turnover, only 1 in 13 of Federal employees are in that category. So when you look at these gross averages, you can see how, for example, that comparison there, it is looking at the total civilian labor force, not at like to like. And as you see, what you mentioned when you come into education or comparing these things, we need to reflect that the Federal workforce is a highly skilled, highly challenged workforce.
Thank you very much. I see my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Cummings. I now yield to the distinguished gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, for 5 minutes.
I thank the Chairman. And if I could pick up where Mr. Cummings was just leaving off. Mr. Berry, if I understand your testimony, what you are saying is that the skill set mix of the public sector, the Federal workforce, is quite different than the private sector skill set of the workforce at large in the country.
Of the total civilian labor force, absolutely, Mr. Connolly. That's my core point. And we really need to compare. We're running, if you will, a company of 2 million employees that is dealing with challenges that rival anything. It really doesn't have a comparison in the private sector because it's bigger than the Fortune 500, if you will. But to compare it to the total civilian labor force, I can see why politically that might be a popular thing to do if you had a certain ideological perspective. But it unfairly compares wages, and it is not an apple-to-apple comparison.
With respect to the size of the Federal workforce, is the current Federal workforce significantly larger than it was when President George H.W. Bush was in the White House in 1991?
Mr. Connolly and Mr. Ross, I can leave this or give this to you for the record. This is from GAO, so I did not make up these numbers. But it shows you the civilian labor force from 1950 to the present. And it is this red line, and as you can see, it's pretty flat. Federal expenditures are the blue line, Federal outlays. So outlays have gone up absolutely over that time period, but the workforce has remained largely stable. And so these are GAO numbers.
In absolute numbers?
Yes. Yes, sir.
So despite the sign behind Mr. Lynch's head, which I'm sure the ranking member would prefer not be put there, and I hope our Republican friends remember this when we're back in the majority. There'll be all kinds of signs. You may not like them. Or we could be civil to one another and actually respect the fact that the ranking member sits there and there shouldn't be a sign behind his head that he doesn't want. But that would be a different issue. Where were we, Mr. Berry? Oh, yes. Despite the hysterics, actually the workforce hasn't grown that much, but the missions have. Is that correct, Mr. Berry?
There's no question.
Can you think of some missions that have expanded since 1991, even though the workforce has not?
Absolutely. And in fact, the majority of that increase is in what we would either be in defense.
Mr. Berry, I'm going to ask you not to point to a sign we're going to pretend does not exist. All right, go ahead.
Would be in either Homeland Security, dealing with the very issue you're talking about since 9/11. We have obviously had to stand up a significant counterterrorism force in the country. Both parties are in agreement that that is something we need to do. We need to protect our borders well. Both parties agree to that. So we need to be careful, and we need to protect our vets when they come home with serious injuries. And we need more nurses and doctors to care for them.
So let me understand. For example, since President H.W. Bush, George H.W. Bush was in the White House in 1991, and the workforce he had, which is roughly the workforce we have, we created a whole new agency of Federal government, Homeland Security. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
In response to the terrorist attacks in 9/11. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
We beefed up FEMA after its utter collapse and fecklessness in responding to Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans and the Gulf Coast. Is that correct?
I would have to check my budget numbers to answer that one, sir.
I think the answer is yes. If you, and of course, since President George H.W. Bush was in the White House, we are fighting two wars right now, Iraq and Afghanistan. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And all of the attendant costs associated with that, including, as you say, caring for the wounded veteran when he or she returns home. And
increasing the handoff in Iraq. There is a stand-up and increase, as Mr. Lynch knows, who has been there many times. And as the military mission is drawing down, the State Department employees are drawing up. So there's an increase of people going into a very highly dangerous area, serving their country and putting their lives at risk. That's a civilian increase. And so we need to recognize that, and that number is folded into this number as well.
Good point, and I'm going to end on that. So in other words, there are civilian Federal employees putting their lives at risk next to uniformed military in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Is that correct, Mr. Berry?
Absolutely. And Mr. Lynch has invited me, and I look forward to being able to attend with him to one of his visits to Iraq or Afghanistan, where we can honor the service of both our military and our civilian workforce that both put their lives at great danger to serve our country.
Thank you. I see my time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. That being the last of our questioners, we'll recess now. Thank you, Mr. Berry, very much for being here, and we'll take a few minutes to have our clerks prepare for the next panel.
Thank you, sir. It's an honor.
Thank you.